Matt Gaetz, of course, is a member of the 115th Congress and serves on the Budget, Armed Services, and Judiciary Committees. His work in Congress focuses on national security, tax reform, regulatory reform, and adherence to constitutional principles. He has been a big Trump supporter and a big investigator of the investigation into collusion. He speaks about it, I thought, with incredible candor and depth here. And here is the interview. Congressman, thanks so much for coming on. I appreciate it.
Honored to be with you.
Well, let's begin with the Helsinki summit and especially the press conference. Absolute hysteria and craziness. What was your reaction to what you saw?
Well, I wish there would have been more focus on the positive interactions in the areas of non-proliferation and anti-terrorism. I think that the United States and Russia have a variety of common interests there. There is no mechanism by which we can sufficiently leverage North Korea and Iran in the absence of some semblance of cooperation with Russia. That said, Russia is not our friend. Russia is a competitor. They engage in a malign influence campaign all over the world where they disrupt elections. And I think that the president likely was better in the private context than in the public context on some of those questions. I think that we've got to maintain better resiliency in our country. I think at the state and local level, a lot of work is being done to ensure that we are more resilient with our election systems. And I think we can anticipate further foreign attempts at influence going forward in 2018 and 2020 and beyond.
Now, you're a very firm Trump supporter. Are you confident that he understands who Vladimir Putin is? I mean, the guy is pretty much a gangster, right? So,
yeah, no, I mean, look, the seminal moment in Putin's life is when he's a KGB agent, and he, in East Germany, the Berlin Wall falls. Germans surround where he is, and he's afraid they're all going to kill him. And so he walks out and says that there are 100 KGB agents inside with guns pointed at everyone. And if they wanted to escape with their lives, they needed to go home. And so that kind of frames Putin's fear of any sort of popular uprising and the brutal efforts he's willing to take, including killing journalists and killing political opponents in order to maintain power. I think the president understands that. I think the president was far more focused on some of the objectively measurable outcomes that we could get from broader cooperation on the proliferation space and in the anti-terrorism space.
Now, people are hammering the president over the fact that he disrespected our intelligence community over this Russian investigation. And there are two investigations. There's the Russian hacking investigation, and then there's this investigation into whether anybody in the Trump campaign colluded with this. And they seem to get kind of smushed together, both in the media's mind and sometimes in the president's mind. Were you upset at all at Mueller delivering these indictments, these new indictments, just before Helsinki? Did that bother you at all?
I mean, I think that the timing was obvious to essentially troll the Strzok hearing that we were having in the Congress and also the president's visit. But it wasn't, Frank, the timing wasn't my biggest concern about these indictments. There's a reason why we don't do counterintelligence in Article 3 U.S. courts. I'm far more concerned that one of these Russians will show up in the United States and stand on U.S. soil and say, I'm here to obtain the full complement of America's constitutional rights. I want to engage in discovery. I want to take depositions, and I want a full trial on these questions. I think that could be more detrimental to our intelligence apparatus than Bob Mueller may suspect.
So, in other words, by indicting them, they left them open to getting the kind of information they might want to get. In
right. I mean, way. You know what we ought to do when people interfere with our elections and engage in this type of activity? We ought to retaliate with force. We should not invite them into an Article 3 court for an airing of grievances. I think it's far too deferential to the Russians to give them constitutional rights in U.S. courts.
So let's talk about this Strzok hearing. It was certainly a lot of fireworks and hilarious fun. I mean, I had a good time watching it. Did you learn anything from this? Did we learn anything from talking to Peter Strzok?
Definitely. This was the first time that anyone associated with the FBI publicly admitted that the dossier was introduced into the intelligence bloodstream through Bruce Orr, who is the spouse of Nellie Orr, who was hired to work for Fusion GPS on the dossier. That had been in the Nunes memo. The FBI had issued broad statements that not everything in the Nunes memo was accurate. And this was the first confession that that was the case. So that's kind of at the outset of the investigation, or what I would call the first rotten bookend. I think on the back end, the new revelation we learned is that when Robert Mueller brought Peter Strzok in and dismissed him from the special counsel's probe, he did not ask a single question about a single text message, right? Like, he didn't say, well, when you said we'll stop him, what did you mean by that? What were you willing to do to stop him? And I'm a lawyer, and perhaps one of the things that Bob Mueller was doing as an attorney was not asking a question he didn't want the answer to. But it's really troubling to me that, like, when Mueller gets rid of Strzok, he has absolutely no curiosity as to the extent to which Strzok's bias influenced investigative decisions up to that point.
Now,
so those are two new facts.
And in terms of Strzok's lover, Lisa Page, we're getting word that in a closed session, she was a little bit more, she cooperated a little bit more. Were you in on that session?
Yeah, Lisa Page was definitely more forthcoming than Peter Strzok. Now, she also maintained that her bias didn't impact any of her decisions. Bias affects the subconscious, I should say. Bias can affect you without you knowing it. That's the reason why we don't let biased people sit on juries or serve as judges over cases or serve as prosecutors. And so Strzok and Page say, we held these views, but that didn't impact our investigation. So in that sense, she was the same as Strzok. But there was one particular text message that Strzok wouldn't give answers regarding that she did. It was the text message contemporaneous with James Comey's firing. And Strzok says, we've got to open up that case we've been waiting on while Andrew McCabe is the acting director. And Page agrees that they've got to go ahead and do that. Strzok would not answer what that matter was about. Previously, Rosenstein had indicated behind closed doors to some of my colleagues that had nothing to do with the Russia investigation. That was some ancillary matter. And we got information from Lisa Page that was inconsistent with what Rosenstein had said and far more illuminating than what Strzok had offered.
One of the things that always bothers me about bias, especially in the media, but this is a good example as well, is not that individual reporters or editors are biased, is that they're surrounded by people who only agree with them. So there's nobody there to say, oh, you're being a little biased. Let's find a different way to say that. Do you have any faith in the Mueller investigation at all?
I don't, because you're right. It's become an echo chamber for the Never Trump movement. I mean, when it's hard to understand why Robert Mueller would hire as one of the attorneys on his team someone who defended the Clinton Foundation.
Right.
It's hard to understand why he would hire the very person who defended the individual who ran BleachBit over the Hillary Clinton email servers. It's hard to understand why he hired Weissman when Weissman had such an active role, literally attending Hillary Clinton's watch night party. So when you look at the staffing decisions, it's really hard to have confidence. Now, when it comes to the facts that are laid out in the indictments, I agree with those facts, not based on the fact that Robert Mueller presented them, but based on the fact that it's consistent with what intelligence officials have said to me all over the world. As a member of Congress, we travel a good amount. And when I go to a country, I typically meet with the CIA station chief. And I have heard a number of stories that I believe to be accurate about how Russia tries to influence and undermine democracies as institutions all over the world. And that's entirely consistent with the facts laid out in these indictments.
But Mueller was appointed not to investigate the collusion aspect of this, wasn't he? That was where he was supposed to go. Not one of his indictments has touched on that.
Correct. And one of the things that concerns me is that there don't really seem to be four corners to what we've asked Robert Mueller to do. Rosenstein provides his initial direction to Mueller and gives that to the Congress. But then there were subsequent memoranda to Mueller expanding his authority that was not shared with the Congress. And that really ripens this question, right? Like, either at the end of the day, it's either elected people that make the final decisions, or it's unelected people that make the final decisions. In most cases, in the executive branch, the elected person is the president, and that's who's ultimately responsible in their conduct, and they're held accountable by the voters. But here, since the president is a subject of the investigation, you have these bureaucrats who believe that they are accountable to no one. And whether you're a Republican, a Democrat, someone who believes in civil liberties like I do, that should concern all of us, that unelected people would have unchecked power to maintain an investigation regarding anything they'd like for as long as they'd like. I think that's troubling.
It also does seem to me, as just an outside observer, it seems to me that they're stonewalling you guys, and they're actually hostile toward congressional oversight. Today, Bill McGurn in the Wall Street Journal suggested that the President Trump should simply declassify all the documents that you're trying to get at so that they can't redact them all the time or hold back on them. What do you think of that idea?
We do need the president's assistance, particularly to declassify documents from before the 31st of July. So the Department of Justice has maintained to congressional oversight members that this investigation began on the 31st of July. But when I asked Rosenstein before our committee what investigative activity took place before that time, he said he would not answer the question. Well, if there was no investigative activity, it would just be easy to say there wasn't anything that occurred before the 31st of July. And so there are inconsistencies in the responses we're getting from DOJ, and particularly in those areas where they've said things that cannot be both accurate. The president needs to give us access to those foundational documents to understand those questions. Because what I think happened is that I think that there were people that were paid to go and collect intelligence on the Trump campaign before the Papadopoulos discussion in London. And if we got those documents, we would be able to prove whether that was the case or not.
What, paid by whom?
By the United States government. I mean, I believe that we're going to see six-figure payments to people who were then asked to go and run and collect intelligence on the Trump campaign.
You believe that the United States government was paying people to collect counterintelligence on the Trump campaign before there was any information from Papadopoulos or the Australians or anything?
Yeah, and my basis for that belief is that when we ask questions about it, they won't answer. And if the answer was no, it'd be very clear. It'd be very easy to just say no, right? Now, I don't want to say that I'm certain of that. Yeah. It's my suspicion, right? And that's how you develop facts throughout a case. And so if the president would declassify that information, we would see whether or not those payments were in fact made. And I think they were, but I'm happy to be proven wrong. If we get access to the documents, or even if we just got straight answers, I'd be willing to say that that was an unfounded suspicion. But as long as they're stonewalling, it really raises the question.
Can you think of any reason why President Trump would not declassify these documents?
I think the president really wants to have a hands-off approach to this. I think he does understand that his excessive entanglement with the process functions would be really, would be a downward pull on his presidency. And so I think he's trying not to do that. It's a very awkward dynamic, right? Where he is the subject of the investigation, but at the same time, he's the only elected person in the executive branch.
I have to ask, if you think that the government was paying people to investigate what was essentially the opposing party at that point, do you think that this goes up to the White House? Do you think Obama was involved in those decisions?
Well, we asked a lot of questions about what it meant when Strzok and Page were texting back and forth about the White House wanting to be up to date on information and wanting to be involved. Again, I mean, I think that would be a very serious charge, but we'll only know the answer if we get the document. So I don't want to say that I'm certain of that. I don't know if it was a lower level decision, but until we're able to really understand that decision tree, it really undermines the integrity and the independence of the Department of Justice and the FBI, because we're left wondering whether or not they were used to obtain a political outcome rather than an investigative outcome.
Wow, that's really something. I have to ask you just one political question. All this, it seems like, will go away if you lose the House, if the Republicans lose the House in the midterms. How are you feeling about that right now?
Well, my concern is that there are people at the Department of Justice who know that. And so time is their friend. The longer we say, okay, well, here's a deadline. Well, now instead of meeting that deadline, we're going to have a meeting. And then we're going to have an extension. And then we're going to have redacted documents. And then we're going to fight over those redactions. And then we're going to set a new meeting and then a new deadline and have more meetings. That seems to be the Groundhog Day cycle that we're in currently. And if the Democrats take over, my suspicion is that Mueller will very soon thereafter issue a report to Congress that the Democrats will use as a basis for impeachment. That's why the midterms are so important. I do believe that if the Democrats take over, Adam Schiff will be elected their speaker, and that the most fundamental question they'll have to manage is the impeachment question, and it will be bad for the country.
Do you think, how are you feeling about your chances?
Well, November is a long way away. I feel great about the economy. And I think that at the end of the day, regular folks just want to know whether or not they have a reason to be more optimistic about their future. I think that's what every election's about. If people feel like their hopes and dreams are more in their grasp as a consequence of what's going on in the country, I think they're likely to keep the current party in power. If people feel like their dreams are diminished, that they don't have opportunity, they can't get that raise, that new job, their business can't grow, then I think they vote for a different group to come in and run the place. Right now, I think, all the data we see is that Americans are more optimistic about their economic circumstances than at any point, certainly since the early 2000s.
Yeah, no question about it. Congressman Gaetz, thank you very much. A really interesting interview. I hope you get what you're looking for. I'd like to find out myself. I think most of America would.
Thank you. If we get the documents, we could come back and chat about them on your podcast.
Please do come back. I appreciate it. All right. Really interesting interview. It's really funny. Whenever there's a Republican who's doing a good job, the minute he's either stupid or evil. So they were saying this is a big meme on the left that Gaetz is stupid. And I was sitting there talking to him and I thought, yeah, you can say something about him, but you can't say he's stupid. All right.